Ayer, the most famous advocate of logical positivism in the English-speaking world due to his publishing of Language, Truth, and Logic in 1936, later claimed the main defect of logical positivism was, quote, that nearly all of it was false. Wittgenstein, in the words of historian of philosophy Oswald Hanfling, quote, first formulated the verification principle by which logical positivism became known. Nevertheless, he made the most decisive break from these ideas when embarking on his later philosophy in the early 30s. Finally, in 1944, John Passmore declared, quote, logical positivism is dead, or as dead as a philosophical movement ever becomes. In this video, I'm going to be doing my best to explain why and argue it should perhaps stay that way. I'll give you 8 reasons why logical positivism and verificationism crashed and burned, but also check the references as well because none of this is really any original work by me, rather it belongs to these scholars I'll be drawing from. So let's first define what we mean by logical positivism, or what is sometimes called logical empiricism, and its related doctrine of verificationism. We'll start with verificationism. Verificationism, a key tenet of logical positivism, says that a statement is only meaningful if it is 1. Empirically verifiable, meaning something we can confirm with our senses, or 2. Analytically true, meaning something that would be true via logic or by definition. As a result, statements about metaphysics, theology, ethics, and aesthetics are cognitively meaningless. They may be meaningful in the sense of influencing emotions or behavior, but they do not convey truth value, information, or factual content. Incidentally, this is perhaps why there's a link between logical positivism and nihilism generally, and moral nihilism in particular. The death of God and all God terms leaves morality to one's will to power or ability to impose their will on others. This link, however, is the topic for another video, though if you're interested in this idea, I suggest sociologist James Davison Hunter's recent book, Democracy and Solidarity, or Alistair McIntyre's classic text, After Virtue, which Hunter's work draws upon. Anyways, logical positivism came out of a group called the Vienna Circle in the 1920s, and included thinkers such as Morty Schlick, Rudolf Carnap, and Hans Hahn. They were heavily influenced by guys like Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell, David Hilbert, and Albert Einstein, among others, and sought to spread a scientific world conception unifying science and philosophy under a naturalistic umbrella. For instance, many in the Vienna Circle were influenced by Ernst Mach's maxim that, quote, where neither confirmation nor refutation is possible, science is not concerned, extending this idea to metaphysics and later meaning as a whole. While the group pretty much disbanded in 1936 when its leader, Morty Schlick, was shot and killed by his former student Johann Milbuch, the legacy of the Vienna Circle and its thought can be felt to this day. In fact, its ideas are popular among Reddit and YouTube atheists, and you can see guys like Matt Dillahunty and Arne Ross saying things that indicate they hold verificationist-style views. In fact, I'd go so far as to argue these two in particular seem to be full-blown logical positivists. Now, before I start my critique, I want to get something that should be obvious out of the way. Much of the spirit of logical positivism, including its desire to be clear about meaning and how we can connect science and philosophy, is all well and good. And I'd further argue that when we can falsify or verify statements, this should really heavily be taken into account. Christians are even instructed to do this. For instance, Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians 5:20-21, quote, do not despise prophecies, and some translations say do not treat prophecies with contempt, but test everything and hold fast to what is good. In general, falsification and verification are tools we can use to gather information and decide what to believe. The problem comes when we try to be too restrictive on what we define as meaningful, and this is something logical positivists realize quite quickly. The first critique I want to talk about is the logical positivists' exclusion of metaphysics, and many saw that the verificationism was problematic because it ruled out metaphysics as a whole. Statements like God exists or God does not exist are meaningless under logical positivism because they are in principle not verifiable. But for many in the Vienna Circle, this was a feature, not a bug. They wanted to renew empiricism, so doing away with metaphysics was a step in the right direction. However, upon further reflection, the distinction between science and metaphysics is not as simple as it may seem at first glance. The question becomes where science ends and metaphysics begins, and it began to look more and more like a boundary between the two was not as clear and easy to define as the logical positivists perhaps naively thought. For instance, some consider testability to be where the boundary is, but then plenty of fields we consider to be scientific may need to be revised or may only be partial sciences, and these are fields like theoretical cosmology, evolutionary psychology, sociobiology, and lots of theories in origin of life where falsification is either impossible, unethical, or just really, really hard. As a result, while the hard sciences like physics and chemistry may seem very clearly non-metaphysical, and even this we'll come back to, plenty of other fields are far less empirically verifiable. Many philosophers of science have even taken aim at Darwinian evolution for this reason, but that's a whole other can of worms I'm not going to get into today. This isn't to say that the logical positivists didn't try to make a clear distinction, it just came out to be much harder than they realized. For instance, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Rudolf Carnap says, quote, all of Carnap's repeated attempts over several decades to give a precise distinction between scientific or meaningful or communicatively adequate statements and metaphysical, non-scientific, non-meaningful ones failed. He therefore became more liberal and less exacting about what was to be regarded as metaphysical, end quote. This culminated in his describing what is called the principle of tolerance, where he described in his book, The Logical Syntax of Language, quote, we are not in the business of setting up prohibitions, but of arriving at conventions. In logic, there are no morals. Everyone is at liberty to build up his own logic, i.e. his own form of language, as he wishes. The issue here is that Carnap has undermined the verification principle by simply relativizing it. Now, Carnap was repeatedly blasted for this, in particular by Hilary Putnam and V.W. Quine, who we'll come back to later. But in summary, the principle of tolerance requires what is known as the analytic-synthetic distinction. Now, I'll explain later what this is and give a few examples, but the main thing to know for now is that the analytic-synthetic distinction is a metaphysical hypothesis about the nature of truth. And as Quine pointed out in what may be the most famous and highly cited philosophy paper of the 20th century, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, quote, a boundary between analytic and synthetic statements simply has not been drawn. That there is such a distinction to be drawn at all is an unempirical dogma of empiricists, a metaphysical article of faith. Putnam, in a similar vein, complained that this distinction itself was unverifiable, and that the whole thing comes down like a house of cards. Speaking of unverifiability, let's move on to the complaint about logical positivism being self-defeating. A common complaint about verificationism and logical positivism is that it is self-defeating, that the claim that a statement is only meaningful if it is empirically verifiable or analytically true is itself not empirically verifiable or analytically true. Well, there is a point to this critique, and I do think it is pretty damning for many non-philosophers who hold verificationist type views. I don't think it's that simple for the more sophisticated Vienna-style logical positivism. Put another way, if it was that easy to refute, I don't think logical positivism would have survived as long as it did among some of the world's top logicians at the time. And furthermore, many of them were aware of this issue, though as we'll see, for many there never really was a satisfactory response to it. Now, one easy way to solve this problem is to define meaning as that which is empirically verifiable or analytically true. And in that case, logical positivism itself would be analytically true, but somewhat uninteresting. Often what we care about is whether a given statement is true or corresponds to reality, not that it matches some ad hoc definition of meaning that a priori sort of dogmatically rules out certain possibilities before observation. So the real question we should ask is, what is Carnap's goal? What is the word meaningful supposed to signify? If Carnap wants to define meaning as that which is true, then it's clear that verification itself is a metaphysical doctrine and one that should be rejected by its own standard. But my interpretation, and there are some other philosophers who do see things similarly, is that Carnap was being pragmatic. He wanted to shift the focus of philosophy, not give an account of truth, and perhaps he was even aware that this move couldn't be justified on its own grounds. However, this self-defeating objection can quickly diffuse the more primitive types of dogmatic verificationism we again see all the time on Reddit. To do so, notice when someone claims we should only believe claims we can verify, itself could not be verified because it presupposes verificationism is true. And some people try to claim verificationism is open to falsification because someone could show it as an error. But the irony is, this claim itself shows verification is an error because it presupposes verificationism is true in the first place. Notice, this is circular reasoning. In other words, this claim only meets its own standard if we first assume verificationism is true. And if someone thinks this is fine, then they should have no issues with Christians who say we can know God exists and know the Bible is the Word of God because God wrote the Bible. Same reasoning here. And really the main point here is that, there's a world of a difference between claiming, we can have more confidence in views that have held up to repeated tests of falsification or claims we've verified more, versus claiming we should only believe that which we can verify and everything else is meaningless. I think that's really the main distinction here. It's okay to have this degrees of confidence in your beliefs, but saying yes and no, this very black and white thing ends up kind of causing all of these problems that we see. Now, to summarize, verificationism is either synthetic, in which case it's self-defeating because this is a metaphysical claim, or it's analytic, but then kind of uninteresting and subject to Carnap's relativism. And if you don't accept the analytic-synthetic distinction, then you open verificationism to a host of other critiques, such as why it needs an ad hoc stipulation for logic, and some of Quine's other issues that we will talk about later on. Another problem with verificationism is that it rejects scientific generalizations as meaningless. The reason for this is quite obvious. Whenever we come up with a scientific theory, we reason from a finite number of observations to a general rule. However, because we have no way of verifying every possible example, verificationism tosses scientific generalizations in the trash as meaningless. Let me give you an example. Suppose you're Andy from the movie Toy Story, and you want to evaluate whether or not your toys are alive. Now, from your perspective, every time you look away, your toys could be behind your back actually planning all sorts of stuff. And when you look at them, they simply play dead. And let's call this the Toy Story hypothesis. Now, to the logical positivists, this is a meaningless hypothesis because it cannot be verified. And fair enough, perhaps this is what the empiricists want. They don't want any sort of metaphysical claim like this that we can't verify to have any meaning. But consider the alternative hypothesis. Let's call this the not Toy Story hypothesis, or the toy hypothesis, which says that your toys are actually not alive and are just toys. Well, the problem is you can't verify this statement either. You can't look when you're not looking. So again, the toy hypothesis is equally meaningless. Now, someone may object and want to say something like, hey, wait a minute, we have more evidence for the toy hypothesis than the Toy Story hypothesis, to which we could respond, what's your frame of reference? And the toy hypothesizer would likely respond with something metaphysical, like simplicity or lack of contrivances. Something like this, is also meaningless to logical positivism. How do you verify simplicity or lack of contrivances? These are metaphysical or aesthetic judgments, which once again have already been tossed in the trash by the verification principle. If the Toy Story hypothesis is out, then the toy hypothesis is out too. And there were plenty of philosophers sort of chomping at the bit to point out these kind of inconsistencies whenever a logical positivist tried to make a special exception for scientific generalizations. We'll come back to those in a minute. Here's another example. Suppose you're a budding scientist in the 1600s, and you observe every time you toss a ball into the air, it comes back down. You may be inclined to suggest that there's a thing called gravity that maybe causes masses to attract each other, which can be described in the language of mathematics. But wait, says the logical positivist, you haven't verified every ball toss throughout all time. In fact, you can't because you're only alive here and now and can only verify things in your immediate environment. So the logical positivist needs to toss out the idea of universal gravitation as meaningless. Not only are you banned from any metaphysical discussion about the cause of gravity or discussing the nature of causality itself, you can see David Hume and Immanuel Kant for more on this, but you're banned for suggesting the results of your theory extend to circumstances you can't verify, such as the past. All speculation about whether scientific theories held in the past or whether a past even exists is meaningless metaphysical speculation. Here's a third example. Suppose you do a bunch of experiments and you observe that conservation of matter appears to be a principle the universe operates by. You never observe matter popping into existence or disappearing, so you think, maybe matter cannot be created nor destroyed. But then you realize that suppose billions of years ago, before there were any observers, one single particle just sort of randomly disappeared, or alternatively that one new particle just sort of sprang into existence. You can't show this hypothesis to be false, and as a result, the idea that matter itself is conserved is meaningless as well. The reason is our limited and finite empirical observation are consistent with either hypothesis. Now, once again, some may argue it's a much simpler hypothesis to not suggest things can come into existence or disappear from existence uncaused. The problem here is this idea of simplicity, as well as causality, are metaphysical hypotheses. The positivists have already jettisoned metaphysics in favor of empirical observation. The logical positivists tried really hard to get around this issue, and all of their attempts pretty much failed. Some tried to say meaningful sentences were ones that could be in principle verified. The problem is this opens the door to a host of all other kinds of metaphysical hypotheses. In principle, the existence of God is verifiable, either in terms of someone having a religious experience or after death. The problem here has nothing really to do with the logical positivists, as they certainly did their darndest to solve this problem. Rather, this is just an issue that has to do with induction and the problem of induction, famously pointed out by Hume. Scientific theories are an example of inductive or bottom-up reasoning, where we go from specific to the general, from a few observations to a general rule. As a result, scientific theories can never exhaust all possibilities, and we should perhaps hold them tentatively, open to revision from new evidence. This is contrasted with deductive or top-down reasoning, where we start with general rules or axioms and reason our way to specific examples. And as we'll see, logical positivism has issues with deduction as well. Now, Hume came before the logical positivists, but he was an empiricist and greatly influenced the Vienna Circle. Perhaps it's ironic then that Hume himself offered an argument that is actually quite devastating to the logical positivists. First, he describes his principle of uniformity of nature, which says that we must assume the future will look like the past. In Hume's own words, we take it for granted, quote, that instances of which we have had no experience must resemble those of which we have had experience, and that the course of nature continues always uniformly the same, end quote. Furthermore, this tendency is not underpinned by reason, and cannot be established on the basis of past experience, because that would presuppose past experience was a good guide to the future, which is the exact point we want to prove. In other words, arguments for the principle of uniformity of nature often beg the question, and Hume thought that this principle could not be established by reason. Well, if it isn't a tautology, nor something we can get by observation, then it is clearly a metaphysical statement, and one that is nonsense to the logical positivists. In other words, our entire reason for trusting the results of science, which is its predictive power, cannot be justified by logical positivism. Now, induction has come under even more attack in the past century, with who may be the most famous philosopher of science, Karl Popper, remarking, quote, induction, i.e. inference based on many observations, is a myth. It is neither a psychological fact, nor a fact of ordinary life, nor one of scientific procedure. And this problem goes all the way back to one of Hume's predecessors, René Descartes, who brought the skeptical hypothesis that we could be deceived by our senses to the forefront of discussion. How do we know we aren't a brain in a vat having simulated sense experiences? How do we know we aren't a Boltzmann brain that fluctuated into existence 5 minutes ago with false memories? Now, Hilary Putnam has a pretty good argument against the brain in a vat scenario, but this doesn't solve the problem of whether our memory beliefs are trustworthy. To give an example, think about what you ate for breakfast on Monday. Now, if you didn't have anything for breakfast, you should probably eat a big breakfast because it's a healthy thing to do. And for me, it was khachapuri, which is a Georgian pastry. Anyways, think about the proposition, I ate khachapuri for breakfast last Monday. First of all, this isn't an analytically true proposition. It's not a proposition that's true by definition. It's grounded in our experience. Nor is this really verifiable either. And why is this? Well, it's possible that I had false memories about what I ate implanted in me instead of me actually eating the thing in question. As a result, the evidence that I'm relying on to support my statement that I ate khachapuri for breakfast is what I would expect to see either if I actually ate khachapuri or if someone wanted to trick me into thinking I ate khachapuri when I actually didn't. Even evidence that would seem to support it, such as receipts, toxicology reports, and photos, could in principle be doctored or fabricated. In other words, whether I actually had the breakfast I think I had is underdetermined by the evidence, and hence the idea that I actually ate it the way I think I did is unverifiable and therefore nonsense. Now, the point here is not to say that it's unreasonable to believe the past is like the future. Rather, it's instead to say that our memory beliefs involve metaphysical assumptions that the logical positivists were perhaps too quick to jettison. We'll come back to this point when we discuss Quine's objection, but suffice it to say memory beliefs are not verifiable because we have no non-circular way of verifying whether the past existed at all or whether it happened the way we assume or think it did. The next critique to discuss is the difference between universal and existential statements. Recall that an existential statement is something like, there exists a black swan, and a universal statement is something like, all swans are white. These often form premises in deductive type arguments. However, universal statements are not, in virtually all cases, verifiable, and many existential statements have a similar difficulty. Recall that universal and existential quantifiers are related through logical negation, and as a result, logical positivism should discount universal synthetic statements like, there are no green swans, as meaningless. Now, Carnap tried to get around this, and the inductive problem more generally, later on by suggesting that theories could be partially and increasingly confirmed by specific examples. He changed directions from his strict verificationist and falsification ways, and began to see things more in shades of gray, in terms of probability. In his book Testability and Meaning, he wrote, quote, if, in the continued series of such testing experiments, no negative instance is found, but the number of positive instances increases, then our confidence in the law will grow step by step. Thus, instead of verification, we may speak of gradually increasing confirmation of the law. What Carnap failed to realize at the time was that Bayes, Laplace, Pearson, and Keynes had a different epistemic way of looking at probabilities, and Carnap later came to see things from their perspective, and radically changed directions at age 52, looking at hypotheses in terms of degrees of confirmation. By reinterpreting probability, going from frequentism to Bayesianism, Carnap undermined much of what the Vienna Circle had previously thought about probability. The Vienna Circle had previously rejected probability as degrees of belief because they thought this interpretation relied upon Laplace's principle of indifference, which was metaphysical and thus meaningless to them. My favorite example illustrating this principle comes from Bertrand Russell. Consider a turkey living on a farm somewhere. Now, the turkey wakes up comfortably every day and uses this fact as evidence that tomorrow he will wake up and be fed as usual. However, little does he know that tomorrow is a human holiday called Thanksgiving, and he's going to end up as turkey dinner on the farmer's plate. So no matter how much evidence the past seems to suggest, there may be additional factors that undermine induction. From the farmer's perspective, the fact that the turkey will be dinner tomorrow, if today is, say, the 27th, is totally justified. In fact, the very reason he kept the turkey on the farm and fed it every day was precisely for the next day. The point being that there can always be additional knowledge that undermines our trust that the past is a good guide for this particular scenario. For this reason and the skeptical reason we discussed previously, statements based on memory beliefs are nonsense according to the logical positivists. And to many, this is too big a price to pay for a theory of meaning that wants to be empirical and scientific. And again, what we see is the restriction on metaphysics constraining what we can actually say about science, and how a less dogmatic stance on meaning actually gives us more room to say it's reasonable to trust scientific predictions. Now, let's move on to the next critique about unobservable entities in science. Scientific theories postulate all sorts of unobservable and unverifiable entities, such as electrons, neutrinos, gravitational forces, genes, and more. These are often called theoretical terms in science, things where the meaning depends on the axioms of a scientific theory. Carnap originally thought only things that could be observed without the help of scientific instruments were permitted. In other words, theoretical terms in science were considered meaningless. To the logical positivists, these theoretical terms are unverifiable and therefore meaningless, and this is a serious blow for a philosophy that wanted to be scientific. Hilary Putnam took aim at this, alleging that logical positivism was actually a form of metaphysical idealism because it rejected science's ability to gain knowledge about nature's unobservable aspects. Putnam savaged logical positivism again for its circularity, and this was brutal because, as we talked about before, the positivists were not big fans of metaphysics. In my view, Putnam had a higher esteem for science than the positivists did because he didn't try to be so dogmatically restricted about it. And Carnap later relaxed this constraint, admitting his distinction was not sufficiently precise to determine a sharp line between observational and theoretical terms, and his theory-observation distinction turned into a continuum of degrees of observability. Again, we once again see this relaxation from this dogmatic, black and white type of positivism into a relaxation, a more nuanced, a more shades of gray type of scenario when confronted with these specific examples, when confronted, ironically, with the evidence, with the arguments. Let's return to our particle example. Suppose you do a bunch of experiments and you observe that conservation of matter appears to be a principle the universe operates by. You never observe matter popping into existence or disappearing, so you think maybe matter can't be created or destroyed. And for the sake of argument for now, let's just suppose you've solved the problem of complete verification, which is totally impossible, but let's just assume it's solved for now. How can we verify the principle that matter is not created nor destroyed? We can only observe matter, not the principle itself. In other words, we infer this principle from observations about matter, but this principle is not something open to direct verification. Therefore, the consistent logical positivist has another reason to consider that conservation of matter is meaningless aside from its lack of complete verifiability and the problem of induction. It is of a different category than things that are directly observable. The solution, of course, is to allow metaphysical statements like the world generally behaves according to fixed scientific laws to be meaningful, and then deriving what these laws may be on the basis of observation. But of course, being open to this invites a host of other metaphysical questions and statements in the door, such as why the world tends to behave according to fixed scientific laws, and whether there needs to be a sort of divine lawmaker accounting for how and why matter behaves the way it does. Once again, these are the type of hypotheses and questions and statements the logical positivists were trying to keep out. But as they tried to let in these more general principles, you kind of let a few in, then the doors open for other theological type of questions, other more metaphysical type of questions. Lastly, we have Quine's critiques in his Two Dogmas of Empiricism, which many see as the nail in the coffin of verificationism and logical positivism. Now, what is interesting to note is I believe Quine himself was an empiricist. He just didn't think empiricism could necessarily be justified on its own grounds. The first issue Quine had with logical positivism had to do with the analytic-synthetic distinction, which we talked about a bit before, but let's expand upon this a little bit. Let's start by talking about analytic and synthetic statements. An analytic statement is something that is true by definition or by construction. For instance, the statement, pediatricians are doctors, is an analytic statement because pediatricians are defined as doctors. Synthetic statements, on the other hand, are those that involve knowledge from the world, something like pediatricians are rich. To the logical positivists, nothing from the definition of a pediatrician necessarily suggests pediatricians must be rich. And here Quine goes on the attack when it comes to definitions of words and how they're used. Who defined a pediatrician as doctor, and when? He explains that when Carnap suggests we explicate, a term that was coined by Carnap meaning improving or refining a definition, we always take into account its pre-existing context. Quine writes, quote, any word worth explicating has some contexts which, as wholes, are clear and precise enough to be useful, and the purpose of explication is to preserve the usage of these favored contexts while sharpening the usage of other contexts. Quine uses the statement Brutus killed Caesar as an example. He writes, quote, truth in general depends on both language and extralinguistic fact. The statement Brutus killed Caesar would be false if the world had been different in certain ways, but it would also be false if the word killed happened to have the sense of begat. Hence the temptation to suppose in general that the truth of a statement is somehow analyzable into a linguistic component and a factual component. Given this supposition, it seems reasonable that in some statements the factual component should be null, and these are analytic statements. But for all its a priori reasonableness, a boundary between analytic and synthetic statements simply has not been drawn. That there is such a distinction to be drawn at all is an unempirical dogma of empiricists, a metaphysical article of faith. Now, as discussed previously, the analytic-synthetic distinction is important to logical positivism because logical positivism says things are true if they are verifiable for synthetic truths or true by definition for analytic terms. If the analytic-synthetic distinction is illusory, then to the empiricist, we shouldn't need anything special for logical truths. Everything could be verified through our senses. It's like saying empiricism and verification works great except when it doesn't. And if we want to make special exceptions for certain logical statements to enforce their meaningfulness, why not also make similar exceptions for religious and moral statements? This is why so many logical positivists held so tightly to this dogma of the analytic-synthetic distinction. Once you let it go, you basically have to either justify logical statements in terms of their empirical verifiability, or you open the door to a lot of other metaphysical hypotheses that the logical positivists want to keep out. The second issue Quine has with logical positivism involves reductionism, or, quote, the belief that each meaningful statement is equivalent to some logical construct upon terms which refer to immediate experience. He writes, quote, Carnap was the first empiricist who, not content with asserting the reducibility of science to terms of immediate experience, took serious steps towards carrying out the reduction. However, this is also where he plans his offensive. He writes, quote, Carnap did not seem to recognize, however, that his treatment of physical objects fell short of reduction, not merely through sketchiness, but in principle. And he gives a couple examples of why this is the case. You should consult Quine's original paper for this. I'll provide a link in the description. Quine continues, quote, Carnap seems to have appreciated this point afterwards, for in his later writings, he abandoned all notion of the translatability of statements about the physical world into statements about immediate experience. Reductionism in its radical form has long ceased to figure in Carnap's philosophy. But the dogma of reductionism has, in a subtle and more tenuous form, continued to influence the thought of empiricists. The notion lingers that to each statement, or each synthetic statement, there is associated a unique range of possible sensory events such that the occurrence of any of them would add to the likelihood of truth of the statement, and that there is associated also another unique range of possible sensory events whose occurrence would detract from that likelihood. The problem Quine had here was that reductionism assumes the truth of a statement can be determined outside of its context. He writes, quote, the dogma of reductionism survives in the supposition that each statement, taken in isolation from its fellows, can emit the confirmation or information at all. My counter-suggestion is that our statements about the external world face the tribunal of sense experience not individually, but only as a corporate body. Quine was famous for writing about the web of belief, or web of beliefs, how our beliefs about the world are often interconnected. Quine thought it was a mistake to try and pretend language is or can be meaningful outside of our experience of the world. So what would undogmatic empiricism look like? Well, to Quine, it takes a more instrumentalist and pragmatic, rather than fundamentalist, approach to science. He writes, quote, as an empiricist, I continue to think of the conceptual scheme of science as a tool, ultimately, for predicting future experience in the light of past experience. He continues, quote, physical objects are conceptually imported into the situation as convenient intermediaries, comparable epistemologically to the gods of Homer. Neither are better nor worse, except for differences in the degree to which they expedite our dealings with sense experience. Finally concluding, quote, one effect of abandoning these dogmas is the blurring of the supposed boundary between speculative metaphysics and natural science. Another effect is a shift towards pragmatism. The irony here is holding too tightly to science as a means for finding truth, while trying to jettison metaphysics and religion, leaves the results of science in a very sketchy place, open to very serious skepticism and questioning. For all these people that try to say, trust the science while also jettisoning metaphysics and philosophy, have dug themselves in a hole where one's belief in science is open to the same criticisms these people reserve for religion and metaphysics. Really, their own standard has come back to bite them. This last critique here is related to this and has to do with the overall project and motivation of logical positivism and verificationism. For a majority of the world's population, ethical and religious statements are meaningful and do make light of their experience. And it takes an incredible amount of hubris to think you can just define away a significant part of the human experience. Ironically, experiencing the world with our senses is also a part of the human experience, so it looks like the verificationists are picking and choosing which parts of human experience they want to keep on the basis of some other motivation that's either personal or philosophical. Now, the logical positivists came to prominence in the 1920s, so think about what was going on around that time and shortly after. We just had a massive world war, and another one was coming, one that would actually show some of the worst atrocities humanity was capable of. And furthermore, many of these atrocities, such as the atomic bomb, chlorine gas, and human experimentation in concentration camps, were directly facilitated by progress or the search for progress in the sciences. Not to put too fine a point on it, but is it really reasonable to suggest that, quote, the Nazis should not have exterminated over 6 million Jews, end quote, is a meaningless statement? I mean, perhaps this was more reasonable to think when this idea of genocide at this scale was just an abstract idea, but it's another entirely when you or people you know or love are affected by it. And this is, once again, where we get back to this idea of the human experience and the motivation for empiricism in the first place. And this is perhaps the biggest everyday objection to logical positivism. It's a reductio ad absurdum based on our own empirical observations and a conviction that maybe not everything we have the power to do is something we should do. So there you have it. 8 reasons why logical positivism is pretty much dead and has mostly stayed that way, at least in serious academic circles. And of course, once again, these ideas, they still float around all the time, though when you encounter them, especially online, you'll probably see them in a much more unsophisticated and primitive way than those like Carnap who were championing these ideas, people like Ayer. And to be honest, I think the appropriate response to those with such an overwhelmingly flawed epistemology is probably more pity than anything else, especially because the people espousing these ideas are often so confident and dogmatic in what has really become an abandoned project and often denounced by its former evangelizers. I mean, consider what A.J. Ayer said, whose logical positivism is the most prominent in English-speaking countries. Quote, nearly all of it was false. To be honest, it's probably time to move on and consider a worldview that has a bit more respect for metaphysics. And along the way, you may find a system that provides more room for trust in science and our own faculties of reason. I'll leave it at that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Here are all the references.